Neil Young likes to take his listeners on journeys, and like he does in his own life, he likes to keep going forward. He doesn't feel the need to cycle back as he's going forward. He just likes to sort of build on what he's created musically.
He's never gonna tread water. He's never gonna stop. He's had more wind than most artists have in one career. You know, most artists don't have a second wind. He's had 3 winds.
His inconsistency doesn't matter at all. He has an enormous number of great peaks, and he maintained his vitality so far for close to 40 years.
Following the muted reception to Zuma, in January 1976, Young travelled to Miami to record an album of material with Stephen Stills. In April, the pair were to embark on a tour, but Young walked after only 18 shows and returned home to work on material for a new album. Released the following year, American Stars and Bars was viewed as a disappointment. Originally to be released as the album Chrome Dreams, 2 months before it eventually emerged, Young recorded a set of country songs for the first side, and the finished work was criticised for being uneven.
You've got the one side which is kind of rocky, and the other side which is very, very country. I mean, it's almost straight country, the style of it. It's more country than Harvest, that album. And I think that rankled a lot of people too, because Harvest was the hippie country. It was the back to the land country. American Stars and Bars, just like Old Ways later on, is pure country. And the long hairs could accept country influences and folk influences. They weren't quite ready yet to embrace straight country.
With American Stars and the Bars, he really lost his way, by which I mean it so happens that we have 2 completely alternate versions of the album, the so-called Chrome Dreams tapes, of which there are 2 separate versions, 2 completely different versions of that particular album, that was ready to go at the end of '76, and that he scrapped. The 10-track version of that album is as good, in my opinion, as On the Beach. You know, and it has certain key material on it, which actually doesn't end up being used until much, much later, ironically, on things like Freedom and Ragged Glory. But you have songs like String Man, one of his great songs that was effectively discarded after being, I think it was debuted at the Hammersmith shows in '76, certainly, which were amazing performances.
And I'm singing for the string man who lately lost his wife. There is no dearer friend of mine that I know in this life.
But then we get the Neil the Tamperer, and this is really the first point at which it starts to become a problem. Ironically, much like Dylan, the same time period, you know, the point at which Dylan's tampering with his album starts to become a problem is round about the time of Desire, the end of '75. Same thing with Neil. He starts to twiddle with the thing. He starts saying, well, maybe I should rework it. I mean, as I say, we actually have 2 different versions of Chrome Dreams. Even that bloody thing he couldn't leave alone, you know, and there's all these alternative sequences, and you start to get a sense he's lost the plot slightly in terms of what it was ever about. And in Neil's case, I think he fell into the trap of trying to make the profound statement rather than saying, done, dusted, put it out, I'll make another record next year.
Despite the criticisms, one song emerged as an undisputed heavyweight in Young's canon, Like a Hurricane.
If ever there's an album that's made by one track, it's American Stars and Bars, because it's lifted by Hurricane, which of course goes down as one of the great Neil Young guitar epics.
Far across the moonbeams, I know that's who you are. I saw your brown
he can come up with Like a Hurricane, and that's absolutely brilliant because he can do that. He is so prolific. He is always writing, he's always recording, you know, and it's an odds game. I mean, not every song is going to be Like a Hurricane. Not every song is going to be brilliant. So you record it, you shelve it, maybe you use some of it, pull it out later, which he's done. I mean, he's recycled ideas from other songs as well. But, I mean, he's the kind of guy that you always want to gamble on because there's going to be a Like a Hurricane coming down the pike someday soon again, whether it's this album or the next album. There's always that gem that he's always going to come up with from somewhere.
I'm always reluctant to talk about guitar virtuosity because some of the great virtuoso guitarists I can't stand to listen to, you know, because it's all technique. With Neil Young, it's all about feel, and that's what makes him a great guitarist. It's almost impossible to talk in terms of him getting better or progressing, or it is what it is. It's a fantastic sound. He hit on that sound very early on with Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, and he was still doing it on Hurricane, and he's still doing it certainly in concert to this day.
Young's next album would see him return to Nashville and both his country and folk roots. Comes a Time, released in late 1978, benefited from vocal duets with the late country star Nicolette Larson, and the album would be Young's first US top 20 since Harvest.
Comes a Time is a lovely album. I mean, after he'd made Harvest, you know, he backed away from repeating that, and I suppose you can say that he moved some way in that direction on Comes a Time. But he was so determined not to make Harvest Mark II, that was a constraint on him in some ways. But the simplicity of it, the return to basics, if you like, make for a quite compelling record.
Comes a time when you're drifting. Comes a time when you settle down. Comes a light, feelings lifting. Lift that baby right up off the ground.
Comes a Time always is sort of positioned as a sequel to Harvest, but in many ways it's much different, because whereas Harvest, part of it was recorded in California, part of it was recorded in Nashville, Comes a Time is truly a Nashville production, as it were, and much more produced than Harvest, because it just, there are violins happening, you know, the overdubs are, you know, a little more pronounced, and it doesn't quite have that, I don't know, the folky elements of Harvest that seemed a little more real. That said, you have a song like Motorcycle Mama, Look Out for My Love, which are, you know, a little edgier and frankly sort of outside the groove of Comes a Time. But those are examples of how Neil would drop certain tracks into the flow just to sort of jar the listener out of the flow of the record as it was put together. But then again, he'll hark back to a song like Four Strong Winds, which was one of his favorite songs as a young boy growing up, and that he would put that on a record at this point in his career is interesting, because he was looking back at a song that meant so much to him as a young boy, but was also looking ahead to winds that he maybe had no idea what, you know, where they were going to take him. I think again he was looking at that somewhat metaphorically for the point he was at his musical career.
Like After the Gold Rush, it's a record where the melodies just keep on coming, the tunes just keep on coming. But they're straighter than the tunes on After a Gold Rush. They are because the basic mood is a bunch of love songs. They're not quite as reflective. They don't have that quality of depth that the tunes on After the Gold Rush come to seem to have if you've listened to the record a few times.
Comes a Time certainly feels like a folk album on the surface, but you know, if you think about one of the tracks that didn't make the record, and that track was a version of Hank Laughlin's #1 country single from 1960, Please Help Me, I'm Falling. That's a real dyed-in-the-wool country choice, as much as Oh Lonesome Me, and it would have been interesting to have that on the album and to see how it might have shifted the balance. But, you know, a song like Field of Opportunity, you know, where he sings It's Plowin' Time Again, very rural in orientation. Sure, it's folky, but the banjo is pretty twangy, so it's a nice mix, kind of a fusion, I think, of folk and country at a very noisy time in pop music.
The noise that was creating the biggest rift in popular music was punk. From the Ramones in the US to the Sex Pistols in the UK, disenfranchised youth had a new voice. Aiming to create a musical year zero and targeting the pretensions and excesses of the old guard, the punk attitude was abrasive and determined. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Young wisely decided to publicly praise the movement. He also befriended the new wave band Devo, finding a common link between his recent artistic methods and the punk ethos. Young's next album, Rust Never Sleeps, was born out of an impromptu jam with Devo and contained a reference to Johnny Rotten. Some rock critics were quick to promote Young's affinity with this new musical movement, whereas others saw his professed interest as a desperate measure.
The notion that Neil Young is the godfather of punk or a source of punk is, as far as I'm concerned, ridiculous. Tonight's the Night grows out of the same impulses that produced punk, but it's in a different culture. Punks were, my guess is that most punk musicians didn't even know Tonight's the Night existed in 1975. They might have discovered it retrospectively, and a few knew who it was. But what they were listening to, it's quite clearly, was the Stooges and Velvet Underground and the New York Dolls. They had much more proximate sources. But because Young was who he was, because he favored a kind of unkemptness, because he liked dirt, because he liked noise, he was compatible with punk. And I mean, not only did Johnny Rotten say that he didn't think Neil Young was so bad, but then Neil Young said that he thought Johnny Rotten wasn't so bad. He wrote about him in a song. He liked Johnny Rotten. He thought Johnny Rotten was interesting. He was smart enough to know that.
I think there is very much a sense in Neil's makeup that he kind of looks over his shoulder and says, why aren't I influencing these people? Why aren't I actually having this impact? And so you've got this odd series of kind of attempts to be seen to be doing that. You know, I mean, adopting Devo, which is bizarre. I mean, I don't mean great band Devo, but Neil Young? You find any Neil Young in Devo, you're a better man than I am. The famous Hey Hey My My, the reference to, it's the story of Johnny Rotten, and you're just going, well, no, it isn't. I'm sorry, Neil, that happened. You carried on. Actually, if there was ever a story, it was that they wanted to wipe you off the face of the earth, because Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were exactly what punk was designed to destroy. Not you per se, but certainly that kind of supergroup.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
Despite questions over the authenticity of its punk origins, Rust Never Sleeps was roundly regarded as a real return to form for Young. Following the tour of the same name in 1978, the album was released the following year and saw the welcome return of Crazy Horse.
My Hey Hey is incredibly powerful. It's almost shockingly violent in its electric incarnation. It is Neil kind of making this big statement about rock and roll, what it means. Does it mean anything? Do I mean anything? Yes, I do mean something. I'm damned if anybody's going to kind of write me off as a sort of, as a nostalgia act or something, or as a sort of, hippie era artist. What I'm going to say is that, in this really sort of violent, angry song, I'm going to make the connection between Elvis and Johnny Rotten, and I'm going to say that I'm part of that lineage. That this is, that music does change people. That it is an important force, and so I feel that that's what's coming through there. That's what he's really saying.
My mind, hey, hey. Rock and roll is here to stay. It's better to burn out than to fade away. My mind, hey, hey.
It was a clever way to open the Rust Never Sleeps album and to end it on the same way. And Young had done contrasting sides before, somewhat unsuccessfully, I thought, on American Stars and Bars, where the two sides tended to be almost antithetical. One was straight country, and one was kind of intriguing acoustic electric Neil Young on the other side. But it seemed to jar a bit. The two, I didn't think, went that well together on an album. You could see what he was trying to do, but I think he did it obviously far more successfully on Rust Never Sleeps. And of course, the great thing about Rust Never Sleeps was that it almost as if he coralled his best songs of the past 4 years or so and stuck them on that album. I don't think there's a dud track on it, quite frankly. The acoustic songs are absolutely stunning. A lot of depth into them. Lyrically, they're very strong. Musically, they're very strong. They've endured. I mean, songs like Pocahontas is a great song on any kind of level, lyrically and otherwise. And the electric stuff has a real warmth to it. I mean, even a song like Welfare Mothers is a great little crazy horse romp. And again, the lyrics are kind of almost risque and in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, and I think work very, very well.
Rust Never Sleeps was the album that was adopted by punk really as a kind of totem, which I always found very odd. In a way, Neil Young had far more in common with the pub rock scene that preceded punk, which was about back to basics. I mean, it was an objection to the pomposity that rock had adopted. And, he loved the sort of back to basics thing and putting together ad hoc bands like the Ducks and touring little Californian bars and trying to be anonymous. And you can see the parallel there with the British pub rock scene. And then punk came along and swept away that whole pub rock scene. But yeah, in many ways, I regard Neil Young more at heart as a pub rocker than a punk rocker.
In late 1979, Young's son Ben was born with cerebral palsy. New albums emerged over the next 2 years, though the critical and commercial failure of 1980's Hawks and Doves and 1981's Reactor indicated that Young's priorities lay outside his music. In 1982, Young signed to Geffen and began work on a new album which would move away from the folk, rock and country idioms he was most comfortable working in. Influenced by the electronic music of German band Kraftwerk, Young's next album, Trans, was an unexpected detour.
I mean, certainly if Neil genuinely took the influence of Kraftwerk to himself, one, he did it 5 years later than everyone else, because certainly Kraftwerk, in terms of their influence upon punk and more particularly post-punk, you know, that influence was already well in effect by 78.
She's a model and she's looking good. I'd like to take her home, that's understood. She's playing hard to get, she smiles from time to time.
I'm sure at some point he listened to Kraftwerk, but the idea that you could successfully assimilate that into, as I say, it's very American-driven type of music. No, it's completely incompatible without rethinking the way that you're going to approach music. And as I say, I mean, obviously, he's not up to that point in his career. It's not even like he's been following or experimenting with the kind of Velvet Underground, MC5 kind of free jazz experimentalism or anything. It's, you know, it just isn't there, you know, electronic or free jazz. And, you know, it's, Neil, I suspect, got into a trap in the early 80s, which is why he managed to upset David Geffen quite as much as he did, where he simply felt that he had to change for change's sake.
One of the interesting things about Trans is how late Neil Young comes to Kraftwerk. You know, Neil Young's almost discovered them, and pretty late in the day, and got intrigued by the whole thing. I think the album's also very much about his obsession with a new toy called the vocoder. He's got this vocoder, and he wants to play with it, basically. He can disguise himself in it. The album's very much about disguise. Apart from the musical elements in it, you've also got a Neil Young new image, which also seems to be partly borrowed from Kraftwerk. He's actually cut his hair really short for the first time since probably '63 or something, and you know. And he's clean cut, just like Kraftwerk are, as an artistic statement almost. I don't know how self-consciously that was an artistic statement on Neil Young's part, but the visual aspect of it should not be underestimated, I feel.
I've tried very hard with Trans to find something in it. I've gone back to it and back to it, hoping that I'm going to discover something that I didn't necessarily hear it in the time. And, you know, I've failed woefully. I mean, it's an appalling album. I don't know what he was thinking. I mean, there is all of this background story about his son Ben having cerebral palsy and not being able to communicate with him, and that perhaps helps you understand what was in his mind when he made the record a little more, but it certainly doesn't make it any more listenable as a record, I'm afraid.
Well, I think with Trans, while Neil Young musically was influenced certainly by a group like Kraftwerk, he also was attempting to take songs that had roots in traditional folk and rock and sonically take them in a different communications direction. Because as we've learned, at that time when Trans was recorded, Neil Young's son Ben was going through some periods where Neil and his wife Peggy at the time had to devote so much energy to their young handicapped son that it took Neil's music in a direction that even he, I think, was surprised at. But if you listen to a song like Transformer Man, Computer Age, and how he took Mr. Soul and re-recorded it in a way that was quite remarkable in many ways. And I think Neil used some elements of these musicians that he was influenced by, but certainly he didn't consciously in any way try to copy a record like the Kraftwerk album of the day. Instead, I think he took what he knew how to do best, which was create these sonic landscapes, such as Computer Age. Even if that song were played on an acoustic guitar, it'd be a great song. But as he used the vocoder and flowed in these electronic sounds, he created these songs that I think musically were able to help him convey what he wanted to say musically as well, about how you don't necessarily have to sound a certain way to communicate what you're trying to say. And I think with Neil's young son at the time, unable to communicate in traditional ways, I think he was trying to say on that record that I don't have to sound like myself to still get through to my audience.
I always thought it was a very good album, actually. It's a weak album in many senses because it's not consistent. It's a pity that he dilutes the album. In fact, the Kraftwerk-like songs on it are the strongest. I mean, Transformer Man and Sample and Hold are two great Neil Young songs, I think. They're surrounded by a kind of half-hearted series of songs, some from an earlier project like the Island in the Sun or whatever project. He can't resist throwing a few sweeteners in there, possibly to mollify the record company for all we know. If that was the case, then I think it was artistically wrong to do that. It doesn't quite go the whole hog. He hasn't made an experimental work in a way that, say, David Bowie did with Low or something, where you're going straight into the heart of it, and I'm going to make a completely electronic record. He's not made an electronic record. He's kind of one of the best of both worlds, and I think kind of slipped between the cracks a bit. And it's a shame that he didn't pursue it. But at the same time, there is some fantastic stuff on that record. And I think it's not been given the full appreciation that it deserves.
The reaction of both critics and audiences to Trans was one of confusion, and Young decided to return to Nashville for his next record, Old Ways. Yet Geffen was unhappy with the results, and a struggle between Young and the record company owner began. A set of albums across the decade would indicate the disruption that this had upon Young's creativity. From 1983's Everybody's Rocking to 1987's Life, to many it appeared that the prolific singer-songwriter had lost his muse.
He made only one good record during the 80 years, and that was Trans. And it probably has more to do with his feelings for his son and a certain amount of dumb luck than anything else. I mean, I feel as if that he and Geffen was expecting him to write another Heart of Gold, and that was why he'd hired him, and Young had no interest in doing that, and that he was throwing product against the wall for the first time in his life. I don't think he did it before, and I don't think he's done it since. I think a record like On the Beach doesn't seem, as eccentric as it was viewed as being and perverse as it was viewed as being at the time. It's a realized piece of work. I don't find that to be true of the Geffen albums. They're hodgepodges, there are good songs on them, or there's that stupid rockabilly album, another case where people say, oh, he made this move. He figured out a way to make a record. Didn't work so good.
Something very odd happened to the Woodstock generation in the 1980s. That 60s idealism was lost. Reagan came in America, Thatcher in Britain, yuppieism. It was the creed of greed. And it was as if all of the values that they had stood for and fought for were now being trashed in the dust. And it clearly had a profound effect on people like Dylan, on people like Neil Young, and it had a very adverse effect on some of their art as well. Dylan found God, Neil Young flirted with right-wing politics. I mean, he made some very odd pro-Reagan comments in the 1980s. And it didn't happen to those who'd come through a little bit later, the post-60s generation, the Springsteens and the Tom Waits. You don't see it happening there. It seems to be specific to the people who grew up in this era of civil rights and 1960s idealism, those people who thought that music was a tool in forging a new world and a better world. And it was if the disappointment and the disillusion of that, when it didn't happen, when it all went wrong, sort of turned in on their own music and had a very bad effect.
Neil Young at that time was lost. And, you know, if you make a series of records that are increasingly uncommercial, or they don't seem to have the Neil Young signature quality about them as something like Rust Never Sleeps did. He certainly wasn't doing a Rust Never Sleeps during this period. He wasn't constructing anything. He was just letting it come out of him he didn't seem to be in control of the artistic process as much as just letting it happen and seeing where it took him, and caused a lot of confusion to his audience at the time, which of course was no bad thing as it turned out.
Towards the end of the 1980s, Young finally broke free from Geffen's clutches and returned to Reprise Records. The album he began working on was based upon yet another genre experiment, big band blues. With a new group behind him, Young produced some of his most cohesive work of the decade, and the album, This Note's for You, was released in April 1988.
When he announces he's doing a blues record, This Note's for You, you think, oh my God, not another genre experiment. But for me, it worked. For the first time, I thought it was actually a very strong and cohesive record. I liked the guitar work on it. I liked the mood of the songs. There was much on it to be recommended. And it was the first sign also of a certain Neil Young critical rehabilitation. That record received a 5-star review in Q magazine, which was astonishing at the time. 5 stars. Particularly after the run that he'd had. And I think it was a cause of great celebration amongst many of us. You can see that Neil Young was finding himself again, that the creative juices were starting to flow, that although he was still doing the genre experimentation, it seemed, and playing with roles, trying to escape, as he said, in disguises throughout that decade, doing a bit of the old method acting, and here he was again playing a role. But this is a role that you could actually, I genuinely believed it wasn't just a Blues Brothers pastiche or something. I think it was a lot more to that. The songs seemed to have a lot more depth to them. They seemed to be, very personal songs at the same time that they were dramatic constructions as well. So when he talked about adultery in a song or whatever, it sounded quite clever. I didn't feel the sense of artifice that I felt about certain other of the Neil Young genre records at the time, where you throw your hands up and say, why is he doing this? I think he'd found something here that did work musically. And as it turned out, it was both the end of something, the end of a series of genre experiments, and at the same time a bridge towards freedom, as it were, and the new Neil Young that came out thereafter.
Young followed This Note's for You by returning to the Crosby, Stills and Nash fold, and the four-piece released a new album, American Dream. Following its release, Young returned to the studio to work on a new solo record, initially called Times Square. Yet after its completion, he again had a change of heart and recorded 6 new tracks and retitled the album Freedom.
Times Square is an album, and it's an entity unto itself, and Freedom is the attempt to take that and turn it into a quintessential Neil Young album. But what he ends up with is an album that doesn't suggest anything like the movement, the forward motion that Times Square would have. you end up with a Neil Young album that will appeal to his old fans because it has a lot of elements of the old Neil Young. Indeed, it's got whole songs that are 12 years old on it. But it's also got elements of Times Square. But of course, they're elements and they're taken out of context. Then, bizarrely enough, he writes a new song which is of the same mould as Times Square, which is Rockin' in the Free World, and sticks that on. And suddenly you've got another hit, which he hasn't had for a long time, and also people celebrating this, what is seen very much as a comeback. And it is. I mean, Freedom is on, you know, again, if you put it on, you say this is a damn fine album.
Colors on the street, red, white, and blue.
Freedom is another extraordinarily constructed Neil Young album. In that sense, it fits in very much, I suppose, with Rust Never Sleeps. He's decided he wants to make an album and actually make a statement. I think he actually sits down and says, I'm going to make an album. I'm going to make a Neil Young album again, which is what that album is. Rockin' in the Free World was much commented upon at the time because, you know, of what Neil Young was seemingly saying politically, and it's a bit like, I suppose, a bit like Bruce Springsteen or something in Born in the USA, let's say. Much misinterpreted song, but it's a song that's anthemic, that everybody puts their hands in the air if they don't know actually what he's talking about.
Born in the USA, I was born in the USA, I was born in the USA, I'm a long gone daddy in the USA now.
Rather like Born in the USA, it's quite a severe critique as well of what's happening in America. It's not a punch in the air patriotic song in a way that Springsteen's wasn't either. But does that really matter? Because everybody at a concert just wants to sing along with it, and so it achieves that too. It's very clever, I suppose, in that sense, and also as what may well be, you know, one of Neil Young's definitive TV performances, where he just blasts through it. That footage, which anybody has seen on Saturday Night Live, is one of the great TV performances of Neil Young. It's the perfect song to do it in. It has everything. He just bursts out of the screen, almost killing himself doing Rockin' in the Free World.
Somehow, whether by luck or design, he hits the moment again with a song like Rocking in the Free World, you know, just as the Berlin Wall is about to come down, and that song becomes almost a soundtrack for that. And it's after a period of being lost for almost a decade, miraculously, somehow he comes back in a perfect fit with the times, and it all comes together. And it's reflected in the music, and it's the best record he's made since 1979. And you then ask yourself, is it the best record simply because the songs are good and the playing is good and he's focused again, or is it the best record because somehow he's come back into this fit with the times, and he was actually out of step for most of the 80s, you know, even though he was sort of making these pro-Reagan comments and so on and so forth. You knew in his heart he was still that old 60s idealistic hippie, and he was a man out of his time. And somehow he comes back into his time in 1989, and that's what you hear on Freedom.
Boosted by a critical and commercial revival, and apparently having hit a new creative stride, Young reunited with his Crazy Horse cohorts for the album Ragged Glory.
Ragged Glory is a mess. And I think there's probably a good album in there. But Neil Young is suffering from the disease that curses just about all his contemporaries at that point, with the exception of Dylan, which is CD-itis. The belief that because there's 72 minutes of playing time, he needs to fill it. And instead of issuing great 35-minute albums, he issues deeply flawed 65-minute albums. And that, unfortunately, is really the curse of freedom, if you like. That's really the point at which he loses that sense of how do you retain the integrity of an album. And it was a thing that he'd intermittently got absolutely right. The one thing he certainly did get right is this idea that, don't over-egg it. Don't. And whereas Ragged Glory is, hey, I can play this style, that style, I can play old songs, I can play new songs, yeah, you can, but actually, you know what? It's a mess.
Ragged Glory is a patchy album. The sound of the record is great, but I don't think it's his most memorable batch of compositions. It's difficult talking about the albums that Neil Young made in the late 80s and early 90s because they come on the back of such a batch of terrible records that you're kind of grateful that he's making anything that doesn't suck, and certainly those records don't suck. I still don't think Ragged Glory stands alongside the records he was making in the late 60s and early 70s. But comparatively, it's a major return to form.
With both Freedom and Ragged Glory, Young had re-established his rock credentials, and younger musicians drawn to his earlier work were discovering something unique and vital. This influence was observed in the new rock movement labelled grunge, which by the early 90s had grown from a West Coast to a global phenomenon, and again Young was being hailed as the godfather to a new generation of rock musicians.
The idea of Neil Young as the godfather of grunge seems to me to have a lot more logic than the notion of him as the grand old man of punk, because in a way, he invented grunge guitar. I mean, a lot of other people did as well, but you listen to that sort of snarling tone that he perfected, going right back to Cowgirl in the Sand and Down by the River and Cinnamon Girl on Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. You can see where that guitar sound that came out of Seattle had its roots, and Neil Young was very much part of those roots. So it seemed to make far more sense to me that people like Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder found an empathy with Neil Young than the Sex Pistols and the Clash had done 15 years earlier.
It's interesting that when I went down to interview him for my book Don't Be Denied in December of 1991, Ragged Glory had at that time sort of brought Neil back to the Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere kind of sound and became sort of ground zero for the whole grunge movement at that time. And he said that what inspired him to record that album and to get back to that sound was really digging back through his own archives. He had already started as far back as 1990 to go through his own archives and start listening to his own stuff, his early stuff, and be influenced by it. And it was playing songs like Farmer John and remembering what that was like and remembering the thrill of playing these really rockin' songs and having fun with them that kind of brought him back to that. And again, and that's kind of the start of the whole grunge movement.
Obviously, there's something nice to be thought of as the godfather of grunge, but the irony of it is it's not there. You can look high and low. I'm sorry, Neil Young as an influence on grunge? No. As an influence on Eddie Vedder? Yes. But then Eddie Vedder's key influences include James Taylor. It's not grunge. It's not, and making an album by turning your amp up to 11 doesn't make it grunge.
After igniting a new wave of interest in his work with the electric albums Freedom and Ragged Glory, Young finally decided to return to the terrain that had established him as a global star in 1972. With Harvest Moon, it appeared that finally he had created the long-avoided follow-up to his most famous album.
saw a woman fine.
Well, I'm a big fan of Harvest, despite its more twee, saccharine moments, if you like. I mean, I think it's a, you know, I think it's a curiously underrated record, and I find Harvest Moon to be a very beautiful kind of autumnal record. There's more pathos in it because Neil is that much older, and because, you know, his generation is that much older, and there is a sense of him looking back, and he's singing about, you know, his guitar, and he's singing about from Hank to Hendrix. He's singing about Harley Davidsons. I mean, there's something quite sort of comical about it in some ways, and the cliche of the kind of blonde waitress on a. I mean, you know, only Neil could get away with these things to me.
Somewhere on a desert highway, she rides a Harley Davidson, her long blonde hair flying.
Oscar Wilde once said that consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind, and Neil Young has proved that maxim time and time again, having spent 20 years telling us that he was never ever going to repeat what he'd done with Harvest, when all these record company executives had spent 2 decades pleading with him to make Harvest Mark II, which only sort of entrenched him more in the view that he was not going to do that. What does he do? He goes and makes Harvest Mark II, actually puts Harvest in the title. I mean, it couldn't have been more blatant. And, you know, it's interesting the interviews he gave around the time, and he openly said, yeah, it is. And it had taken him 20 years to reach a point where he was comfortable with doing that. He had this, and again, I mean, this is why he appealed to the punks and to the grunge movement. He had this fear and hatred of ever repeating himself. Yeah, and I think that's why younger generations of music fans have always related to Neil Young. He was never content to repeat himself. In fact, he was terrified of repeating himself. And it took him 20-odd years to finally say, well, hey, why not? You know, that was a nice record. Let's make another one like it.
Because I'm still in love with you, I want to see you dance again. Because I'm still in love with you on this harvest moon.
Harvest Moon is a lovely record. I mean, lovely songs, full of a lot of love and feeling and passion, and you know, I love Neil Young in that mellow mode. I love the guitar epics as well, but he has the ability, and you hear it on Harvest Moon, he has the ability to do that gentle, acoustic, tender thing without sounding bland in a Radio 2 kind of way. And very few people have that. And that's why Crosby, Stills and Nash needed Neil Young. You know, without Neil Young, I mean, wonderful harmonies and all the rest of it, but they were always in danger of toppling over into a kind of blandness. Neil Young, even in his gentlest, tenderest moments, always brought a kind of edge with it as well.
Young was in one of the most successful periods of his career, and following the release of Harvest Moon, participated in one of the MTV Unplugged concerts, his electric material being reworked imaginatively for an acoustic setting. The subsequent album of the performance continued this resurgence and was yet another commercial and critical success.
Neil Young, like Dylan, is one of those artists who I don't think ever puts on the same show twice. And certainly in concert, he's not content simply to try and recreate what you've heard on the albums. The concert experience is a form of artistic expression in its own right. And that means you can get him on a great night and you can get him on a not so good night. I mean, playing live with Crazy Horse is one of the great experiences of live rock and roll, to see that in concert. I mean, he's also compelling just playing with an acoustic guitar as well, and you know, in many ways it was the acoustic MTV album that really put him back on the map in the early 1990s. But the great thing is that the concerts are something quite different from the records, and you know, if you go and see Coldplay, basically you see the record performed in concert. With Neil Young, with Bob Dylan, with the truly great artists, it's not like that. There are the records and there's the concert experience, and they're two quite different things.
In 1993, before setting to work on a new album, Young was shocked by the news that Kurt Cobain, lead singer of the seminal grunge band Nirvana, had killed himself. Young was further shocked when hearing that an already controversial line from My Hey Hey, "It's better to burn out than to fade away," had been quoted in the suicide note. This tragedy, and Young's apparent connection with it, led him to compose one of the most sombre albums of his career, Sleeps with Angels.
Down in the valley, the shepherd sees his flock is close at hand, and in the night sky a star is falling down from someone's hand.
When Neil is inspired by tragedy, often there is an emotional currency that he feels is there for him to use. And rather than, I think, using it in a way that is calculated, I think he views it as he doesn't have any choice. He's following this emotion that is welling up in him creatively that results in songs that are, gosh, you know, he doesn't know where they come from. It goes in directions that may not have been there had he not been so deeply affected by the loss of this young musician who he frankly didn't even know that well. But he felt the loss and felt it in a way that it directed him and drew out of him certain elements of his musical creativity that I think he was willing to follow.
And one of the oddest, most mysterious records in the Neil Young canon. If you compare Sleeps with Angels to Prairie Wind, on both those albums you have not pastiche, not Neil Young looking at Neil Young and trying to reconnect with a Crazy Horse sound that he does with Broken Arrow, or the pastoral sound that he does with Silver and Gold or whatever, all of which incidentally are interesting records, and all of them should be looked at again, because it is Neil Young trying to connect with aspects of himself, and it's the aspects which if you look at the individual songs, are interesting. But on Sleeps with Angels, he's doing something entirely different. He's taking Crazy Horse, he's given them instruments that they're completely unfamiliar with. He's creating new sounds as a result. Sonically, it's a totally different album, and lyrically, it's on a level that is beyond mysterious. I mean, it ends with a song called A Dream That Can Last, in which Neil Young seemingly actually goes to heaven. The cosmology on that album, as some kind of religious statement or whatever, is well worthy of looking at independently. It's an album that's been, I think, completely lost in the Neil Young canon. It's up there with probably one of the greats of all of his albums, and it doesn't really get the critical respect, I don't think, that it deserves, or the analysis that it deserves. And it's certainly one of the most powerful things he has done.
In 1995, Young went from mourning the passing of one grunge legend to recording an album with another. The group Pearl Jam had been connected to Neil Young since they toured together in 1993, and the band's lead singer, Eddie Vedder, cited Young as one of his key influences. After After playing together at Young's induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they decided to record an album in 2 quick sessions. The result was Mirrorball.
Neil Young has always enjoyed working with different bands. You know, Crazy Horse are kind of there on the back burner, come out every time he needs them. He's always liked the challenge of working with different people. I mean, it was never the intention with Mirrorball to make an entire album with Pearl Jam. It was going to be 2 tracks. Those 2 tracks went so well, they kind of spontaneously made an entire record. I think the record sounds a little bit samey, to be honest, but you know, the spontaneity of it, I think, makes it a worthwhile exercise. And Neil's always loved those kind of projects. You know, those kind of projects that happen half by accident. His career, he has a history of when he plans things, they go wrong, or he finds a detour or a more interesting turning down the way. You know, I mean, those whole list of albums that were planned that never came out and something else came out instead. You know, Chrome Dreams, Homegrown. There's a whole catalogue of Neil Young albums that were never released. And, you know, Mirrorball fits into that pattern. It was going to be 2 tracks with Pearl Jam. Hey, this is great. It's really working. Let's make an album. And, you know, one of the best records he made in the 1990s, even though I think it could do with a little more sonic diversity.
Working with Pearl Jam was a wise move in theory that, as far as I'm concerned, didn't work out in practice, in part because Pearl Jam is too good a band, right? So that it just doesn't quite gel in the same way that his records with Crazy Horse do, unkempt as those records continue to be. But as far as, do I think it was wise for everybody to like? Sure, it was wise. I mean, but clearly were kindred spirits in crucial ways, except that Young always has that folk singer element in him, which I think sometimes most of the people in the grunge movement just don't understand and also don't have the talent for. That don't have that particular talent. I mean, that is the thing that he brings to the noise party, is this incredibly deft, simple sense of how to construct a tune. He just does it a lot more frequently than they do it. They know they have to have good tunes, but it's not easy for them. And for him, it seems to be remarkably easy.
The second half of the decade was a quieter period for Young. In 1995, he composed the startling soundtrack to Jim Jarmusch's seminal western, Dead Man. He was reunited with Crazy Horse the following year for Broken Arrow, which failed to attract the same critical acclaim and commercial success that his early 90s output had attracted. And in 1997, Young again worked with Jarmusch for the live album and concert film Year of the Horse. In 2000, after a reunion with Crosby, Stills and Nash, a new Neil Young album was finally released after months of speculation, Silver and Gold.
Good to see you. Good to see you again. Good to see your face again. Good to see you.
Silver and Gold is the album where he does really stop moving forward. There's an air of being becalmed about that record, which even in his acoustic vein on Harvest and Harvest Moon and Comes a Time he'd never done before. I mean, the sound of Silver and Gold to me is someone in late middle age growing a little bit too safe and too comfortable with everything, which has always been anathema to Neil Young, and I think he was probably acutely aware of it.
Good to see you. Good to see you again.
Neil felt he had become becalmed on Silver and Gold, and he analysed the problem on the next record, which was Are You Passionate?, which is a much maligned record. It's not a great record, but I think it's got some very interesting things going on there. I think he looked at Silver and Gold and felt that it lacked a certain passion, which is why the next record is Are You Passionate? And it's got something of a theme, that album, which is about how you keep your passion, how you keep fresh and thrusting and moving forward in late middle age. How do you do it? And I'm not sure he necessarily resolves the answer to anybody's satisfaction, but it's interesting that he's asking those questions. And the opening track on the album is about his daughter, who I think was 17 at the time, and he's saying, "Don't leave home just yet." And this is not a traditional rock and roll subject. Here is a father addressing his 17-year-old daughter, and trying to come to terms with her growing up and becoming her own person and no longer his little girl. It's a very, very interesting subject to address in a rock and roll song, and very few people have done it. I mean, Dylan obviously addressed aging on Time Out of Mind. Kate and Anna McGarrigle have written some songs about this as well, but it's fairly rare. I mean, Mick Jagger has never, as far as I'm aware, written a song about what it's like being 60. Maybe the Rolling Stones would make more interesting records if they did address the real world in which they now live, rather than still pretending to be 25. And that was what I found interesting about Are You Passionate? It got some of the worst reviews of Neil Young's career. And it is a flawed album, but I think it's a very interesting record at the same time.
The critical and commercial failure of Are You Passionate, Young's long-planned collaboration with Booker T and the MGs, did not deter him in his continued search for innovation. With the 2003 album Greendale, Young split his audience like never before. A concept album involving a narrative set in a small town, it was first performed internationally as a lengthy live show before the simultaneous release of the album and a feature film of the same name.
Neil admits that he was inspired by his father's sort of newspaper days. He wanted to get back to creating almost a novel with music, sort of a cinematic storyline with not necessarily as much differentiation between the songs, but have a storyline literally begin and end with like an actual novel. And to my ears, just songs such as Be the Rain and Sun Green, I mean, those, even though they're part of a story, I mean, they rank personally with some of my favorite Neil Young rock songs of all time.
Sun Green started making waves on the day your grandpa died, speaking out against anything unjust or packed with lies. She chained herself to a statue of an eagle in the lobby of Power Co. and started yelling through a megaphone, "There's corruption on the highest floor."
I think that commitment to that concept is borne out in the energy that he brings to the music. And I think it works from the standpoint of Neil is so into the story that when he's telling you on stage these stories about Sun Green and her experiences with the earth and everything, it doesn't sound manufactured. It sounds like, even though he made up these characters and made up this story, made up this world, this mythical world, that he is doing it in a way where it comes to life.
I interviewed Neil in 2003, and he talked about how, he actually said that he'd just die if he didn't keep on trying to change and keep on pushing the envelope and trying to do something new with each album. At that point, I think we were talking about Greendale, and he was saying really that he'd had to find a new challenge, and that was what Greendale had been about, taking on something that he hadn't really done before, constructing this whole strange world, really. I don't think it really works as a record, but if it's what keeps Neil Young live and on track and ticking. The live concerts he did around Greendale were very, very interesting. I mean, nobody else, with the possible exception of Dylan, could really have got away with it. I mean, he played, this is before the album had come out, he played these new songs that nobody had heard for almost 3 hours. He insisted that the bars were closed while he played because he wanted us to pay our full attention to these songs that we'd never heard before. So everybody's getting very, very restless. And then he eventually did an encore of sort of 2 or 3 well-known songs. But it was a fascinating experience. Although we didn't know these songs, and although there were periods of considerable tedium, you know, here was a great artist still trying to be creative and do something new. And I mean, in many ways, what was most appealing about those concerts were the lengthy introductions he gave to the songs themselves, in which he set the context of Greendale and this town that he'd invented. And I mean, it was a quite extraordinary thing to do. Again, I think it was flawed, but I'm very glad that he did it, because there aren't many people who have sustained a career this long who are still brave enough or interested enough to even try doing something like that.
Well, Son was out and sitting on the back of her flatbed truck. Looking up in the sky, watching a big airplane flying by about 5,000 feet up, getting ready to land at the airport. She was
he
very
played the
proud.
Hammersmith Odeon, he played the whole of that. Extraordinarily pleased with itself, Greendale, Suite of Songs, despite the fact that we were all just sitting there kind of yawning and just frankly wanting to leave. You know, there's a sort of arrogance there that it really sticks in my craw, you know. I mean, he really clearly thought Greendale was some extraordinarily brilliant work of art, you know, and it just isn't. It really turned me off. It was kind of like there's no one tapping you on the shoulder to say, come on, mate, you know, we can't indulge everything you do.
It was Neil Young trying to do something that he possibly isn't that good at, you know. He's not Lloyd Webber or something, you know. An album like Greendale must ultimately rest or fall, I think, on the strength of its songs. And I think any great musical is the same. And so if you've got something like West Side Story, it's not the plot of West Side Story that makes it, whether it's borrowed from Romeo and Juliet or not. It's the power of a song like Somewhere or something that makes that record.
Someday you'll find everything you're looking for. Someday.
The songs individually aren't strong enough. They're too allied to the subject matter. And this was Neil Young's problem, I think, with Greendale. You've got a great song on there called Bandit, which works independently of the project. But I don't think the other songs necessarily do work as well independently of the project. And it's difficult to see individual songs detached from Greendale and continuing in the Neil Young canon. And finding a new life as genuine songs. I think most of those songs are so strongly allied to that particular concept that they're lost within it. You know, the songs about Grandpa and anything don't work to me as well as a song like Old Man or something. They're not commentaries on old age. He achieves that later very, very well, extraordinarily well at times in Prairie Wind. But in Greendale, it's too constructed as a stage thing.
With his next album, Young decided to return to the soft country rock sound of Harvest. During its recording, he suffered from a brain aneurysm, and amidst reports that he was in a more critical condition than was actually the case, he created what would be hailed as his most coherent album of the decade, a reflective, mature work entitled Prairie Wind.
The last 10 years of Neil Young's life have been, to me, fascinating in a sense. There have been critiques of the last decade, and it's been pretty well said that Neil Young's treading water, that he's doing the kind of same old stuff, that there have been a series of albums which really are quite weak, or that we've heard them before. I find it intriguing when I listen back to those albums, because I think there's a certain sense of Neil Young trying to find Neil Young within those records. Also, over the past decade, Neil Young, for the first time, I think, has had to confront his own mortality, not just as a living human being, but as an artist. And I think he addresses it artistically on Prairie Wind, where there is an album that's written when, you know, he had an aneurysm, he was aware that his father was in decline, and it's a song about memory and lost memories and trying to connect with something that is both lost, but he wasn't concentrating, he missed it. And all those songs, they're almost Alzheimer's songs in a sense. They're not just songs about his father, they're songs about himself, and the prairie itself is a metaphor for something mysterious and lost that he has to find. And a lot of Neil Young's best songs have been about a quest. And that album is about this quest for something lost.
Prairie Wind's a very intimate album, and I think that is why it connects with so many people. It's coming from this very real place that people can relate to. They don't have to work to decode it. They have parents, they have health issues of their own. They're wondering about their own legacies and what they're going to be and what they're going to mean. And so it's something that is more universal, perhaps, in its appeal than other projects that were more esoteric or arcane.
I think the lyrics in that album harken back to a harvest period of time, but I think the themes also harken back to a period even before that. And he's talking about images of northern Manitoba, of hunting with his family, of Cypress River. He even named Cypress River where the young family homestead was, and there's still young, family members who live there. The images of the prairie, the openness, the open skies, the simplicity of life. I think all of this is something that he longs for at this point in his life, is a much more simpler life. He mentioned as well that one of the songs was inspired by the empty nest syndrome. His daughter's gone off away from home and gone to university, so there is that empty nest kind of a thing happening that he feels very strongly. He has said since the album came out that someday he'd love to move back and live in Canada. You can't imagine him coming to live in Toronto or Winnipeg or Vancouver. He's going to live somewhere out in the prairies, somewhere very simple. So I think it's a return to musical form for him in terms of style, in terms of lyrics, a return back to the harvest period. But I think as well, it's Neil doing some soul searching and facing his own mortality on that album.
Was he thinking about my country or the color of my skin?
It's been 15 years since Ragged Glories that he's made a record that seems to me to have that kind of significance, where this is a record that you can certainly imagine people wanting to have on a desert island, pulling out to play because they want to hear Prairie Wind, as opposed to Neil Young. People say it's his death album, maybe because he had this brain aneurysm, and no doubt that got his attention, but the way it got his attention was not that he was writing about death or writing some kind of a summum, but I think that for the first time in his entire career, he decided to be completely clear. You listen to these simple songs on records like Comes a Time, and you will discover that in some cases, you don't have any idea what they're about. You love them, and you remember lines from them, and the lines mean something to you. What do the songs mean? Well, you could make it up. but you don't really know. On Prairie Wind, you know what every song means.
When God made me, when God made me, when God...
Young is writing these extremely literal songs. I mean, these are songs that are as literal as, say, a Diane Warren song, right? Except that the presentation is completely unornamented, the presentation isn't unornamented, but it seems unornamented. No matter what choruses or horns or strings are playing on the record, it seems as if, no, I just have this thing I need to say, and I have 3 minutes and 24 seconds to say it in, and here it is. And he does it again and again and again. He does not fail on that record to do that on a single song. It has the same kind of quality as After the Gold Rush. I wrote about it, I picked up on it late, had to write about it kind of fast because it was at the end of the year and I needed to get it in, and I'm sorry that I didn't give myself another month or two to really live with it, because I think it's a record that just will grow.
Once again, in a period of critical and commercial esteem, Young aims to continue his struggle for innovation and musical development. In this latter part of his career, reaction to his work has left both audiences and critics divided. Many have felt that he was simply repeating past formulas or making botched attempts at new directions.
For the record, I think Neil has lost it. I don't think Neil has got it anymore. I think he really is resting on his laurels. I think he's become slightly too comfortable in his own skin. The last few records have left me pretty cold. I think they're lazy. I don't think they have the emotional edge that Harvest Moon or the earlier stuff has. I think Harvest Moon was the last great album for me. I think he's too comfortable in his own shoes now, and he needs to try on a new pair of shoes again. I mean, it may be too late, He's had more wins than most artists have in one career, Most artists don't have a second wind. He's had 3 wins.
Yet with the release of his latest album, Living with War, Young has again shown that he is capable of moving forward. His first real political record since Ohio, he has left the reflective, very personal world of Silver and Gold and Prairie Wind behind him, and proved that he is an artist unlike any other in American popular music, a man of constant change.
Neil Young's always been a chameleon, which is why he made genre albums, folk records, country records, rockabilly records, grunge records. But I think he's probably now reached a point where he's all of those things and none of them. He's got a body of work that just stands for what it is. It's Neil Young music, and there are very few people who have reached that position. He's one of them, Dylan is another, but you can count them on a single hand.